Hello everybody and welcome to this webinar on teaching critical thinking. My name is Nicola Hartley and I am a commissioning editor in the Higher Education Department at Oxford Uni Press. Joining me today is Dr. Sarah Ivory, who's a lecturer at Edinburgh University. Sarah is based in the business school and she has expertise in sustainability and business, as well as in critical thinking pedagogy. On top of this, she is an incredibly passionate teacher. In fact, she's an award-winning teacher, and I'm no doubt that her enthusiasm and passion will shine through today, just as it has done in many other ways during conversations we've had in the past. So yes. Thank you everybody for taking the time to join this webinar, and we intend to keep it as applied and as useful as possible. This session will be recorded, so if you feel that colleagues would benefit from this, there will be a link made available shortly afterwards for you to send to them for them to watch at a later date. So we're going to structure the webinar as follows. So Sarah and I will talk to each other for around 20 to 25 minutes. Then we will leave 20 minutes towards the end of the session for Q&A. Please do feel free to engage with the discussion throughout. You can pop comments in the chat box and you can also pop some questions in there. And towards the end of the session, Sarah and I will answer those questions. The talk today is going to be structured around three main areas. So firstly, Sarah and I will be exploring the complexities in teaching and learning critical thinking. Secondly, we're going to take a look at some pedagogical approaches to teaching critical thinking. And finally, we're going to conclude to look at the overall aims of critical thinking. So without further ado, let's get started, and I hope you enjoy this session and find it useful. So Sarah, when we think about complexities in teaching and learning critical thinking, what exactly do we mean? And more importantly, what advice can we offer to lecturers in navigating these complexities?
So thank you, Nicola, and hi to everyone who's joined. Thank you so much for being here. My concern, I guess, let's start with that, is that we're teaching our students that life's too simple, that these students come into university and we kind of say, okay, now we're going to teach you the foundational knowledge of our discipline. Here's what you need to know, repeat what you need to know in a test, and well done. You're done. You're through university, or at least you're through the start of university. And I think that is a concern for two reasons. One is our students aren't idiots. They're not dumb. They know that the world is a really complex, challenging, hard place. They're well aware that there's a lot of difficulties in the world. And so by teaching them or showing them or starting them out with this kind of simple story, I think it doesn't do credit to them and to their ability and their knowledge, or to how we are approaching what we want for them. So let me explain that with what we've done at my business school. Is we've inverted our process. So we used to sort of teach the basics or the simple parts of business in the first few years, and we got onto the complex discussions later. We've swapped that around, and we've done that for a very specific reason. It's because they come in and I teach them in their first semester, so I'm teaching them right now, and we say the world is a really complex place. There aren't easy answers to so many questions across all disciplines, but we need to find a way to grapple with that complexity. One way is to learn foundational knowledge. Okay, we have to know some stuff, but it's not the only way. And actually, if you just know things from university, you're not going to be very successful in the future. You've got to be able to do things with what you know. And so I would advise any lecturers thinking about how they're teaching their disciplines to start with complexity, to start with a problem, to say, here's a problem that actually doesn't have a solution. Here are some ways we're going to approach a solution. I use critical thinking. Others might use different ways. It's not the only one. But here's a way we're going to approach coming to a solution. And that brings to my kind of second level of complexity that I think is really important. And that is that university is a complex thing. Learning at university, transitioning through university, it's a really complex thing for students. And I actually think that lecturers, many lecturers, do not do themselves enough credit for how much they help and teach their students, not about the stuff that the students learn, but about everything else, about the fact that we help students become adults, if it's an undergraduate program, about the fact that we help students learn how to learn, about the fact that we help students love learning. I mean, that in itself is such a gift for students. And then from a critical thinking perspective, about the fact that we help students learn how to think critically about anything. We start with our discipline, that's our job, but they can apply that later. And so in this complex world that they live in and they know they live in, and with all the things we're doing to help our students, I think we need to be more explicit about that up front. So we don't say the aim of this course is X, Y, Z related to my discipline. We say the aim of this course is for you to become a more sophisticated thinker. And in this case, we're applying that to our discipline. But that has benefits well after university. And I don't just mean in a graduate role, although obviously it does, but also just as global citizens, you know, just as people who are needing to navigate this really complex world.
Yeah, and especially needing to navigate an environment where they're faced with tidal waves of information right at their fingertips. Having the ability and the confidence to just think a little bit more carefully about what they've been presented with in social media, from their peers, from their families, from other networks, will stand them in really good stead in, you know, in life, as you say, as global citizens. And just to go back to the point, Sarah, when you said, you know, this way in which we approach problems, that is at the crux of so many jobs right now. So there are, you know, people often want guidance and guidelines within roles and processes and workflows, but things are changing so rapidly that guidelines, processes and workflows aren't always there for them to follow. And employers are increasingly looking for students who can not only navigate these areas of complexity, but embrace those areas of complexity.
Absolutely. And that sense of actually almost enjoying it, almost saying, look, that this is what it's meant to be. So at the moment I hear, sometimes I hear people saying, well, I can't wait until things are back to stable again. It's never going to be back to a stable situation. There really wasn't one before. We were just kind of in a lull moment. But also that kind of hope is a shame, because actually here is where our critical thinking skills can come to the fore. And also people sort of suggesting that they're, you know, let's not talk too much about COVID today, but this sense that there should be a simple answer to this. And that shows people who haven't gone through that process, that is our job as university lecturers, of saying there isn't a simple answer. There isn't a simple strategy to follow. There isn't a simple thing that people are just not realizing we should do. All of it requires really difficult arguments, really difficult evidence that isn't all there, and having to accept that that's the norm and that's okay. That's how we approach things.
Yeah, and to add to that, you know, I think it is important to be frank with students up front to say, you know, this is going to be tough at first, because many students come from an educational background, particularly in the UK, where they're not taught to think independently, they're taught to learn and repeat. So yes, it might feel uncomfortable at first, but with practice you will get there. And so I suppose it's about trying to strike the balance between being frank but empowering as well. Like, once you have these skills combined with the foundational knowledge, that will stand you in good stead for the future.
Do you know, and also, I mean, I know we're going to talk about this at the third question, but this sense of giving them the skills and the tools to work out how to do that. So this is, I don't want to for a moment tell lecturers, and I know you won't be interpreting it this way anyway, but I don't want to say just throw the complexity at them and see what sticks. That's not our job. We scaffold this. We show them the complexities there, but this is how we approach it. Here's the tools we use. Here's the structures we work our thinking around. So it's not about saying it's all complex, throw your hands up in the air. It's about saying it's all complex. And therefore, those of us who've developed this ability to be critical thinkers are much better suited to cope with that. So actually, it's not about trying to worry or scare students. It's the opposite. It's trying to give them the tools and the confidence to cope with that. And I find with my students, I've been dealing with the first year of our cohorts for a number of years now. And I find that they love that. They've got no problem with that. In fact, most of them are absolutely ready, ready to be given independence, to be given the, what's the word? To be made to feel like they have a right to a voice. They have a right to develop their own thoughts. They're not just there to learn and repeat. It doesn't happen in the first week. In my first few weeks, I get some very worried students, but what answer you were expecting? I'm not expecting an answer. I'm expecting an argument that's well developed. And it only takes them one semester to get to that point. And one semester is nothing in the course of their whole lives.
That's really well put, Sarah. So the fact that you're, not expecting an answer, but you're expecting a well thought through argument. And just thinking about the point that you raised then about scaffolding the learning. So that's obviously one pedagogical approach that we can take. So sort of moving on to our second question now, what other pedagogical approaches do you think are most effective in teaching critical thinking?
So you asked me to have a think about this, and I don't want to go on forever. So I've chosen one that I think is so valuable, and I would be surprised if anyone guessed the one I'm going to say. And I've chosen telling stories. I think stories are incredibly valuable generally. I think right now in the difficult situation we're all in as educators, they're even more valuable. I think they're valuable generally because stories help our people, students especially, to create a narrative and a person and a place around something we're trying to explain. And I think that is really valuable. It makes things that can seem a little abstract become quite real, become quite tangible, tactile. And I think that's really valuable for our students. So I tell a lot of stories about my past. I had 10 years in business. I tell stories about that. I tell stories about all the degrees I've done, all the different lecturers I've had, the good ones and the not so good ones. I tell stories about my past students all the time, obviously maintaining anonymity. But I tell stories about that. And this is the second reason I tell stories. Right now, people have never felt more alone. Students feel alone. I feel alone. All I do all day is talk to this computer screen and record stuff, okay? Or if I'm doing an in-person or an online tutorial, I'm talking to a chat box, okay? We are all feeling alone, and our students so much, and we need to make them feel part of something bigger, part of something that is special. And a university degree is a special thing. I know it feels like a right for a lot of people, but it is still a massive privilege to be university educated. And so by telling stories, we help the students to understand people have come before you. People have gone through this process before you successfully. People have faced the challenges you faced before. So, I'll tell a story about when Anastasia came to see me, and she sat down and she said, I'm really overwhelmed because I'm not learning enough from your course. And I asked her a few questions, and it transpired that she was studying from the moment she woke up to the moment she was going to bed because she had to learn everything. And her brain wasn't taking anything in. So the hours she was spending was not translating to learning. And I said to her on the spot, you are studying too much. Stop studying so much. And this weight lifted off her shoulders, and she found a much better balance so that what she did study, she learned. So that's one story I tell. And, I guarantee you, for everyone watching today, when you go home tonight, when you talk about this tomorrow, you'll remember the story about Anastasia, because we remember stories. And also it creates a sense of sociality. So there's a great book, if I could promote a book that's not my own, it would be by Joshua Eiler, and it's called How Humans Learn. Such a good book. Just 5 chapters with the 5 main things that humans learn. There's a chapter on failure, there's a chapter on curiosity, but there's one chapter on sociality. We learn from social situations, we learn in social ways. And at the moment, our students often don't have that sociality. So we have to create that by telling stories, by making them feel like we've been here before, we've done this before. Many students have been here before. So it's creating that ability for them to be part of something bigger and something quite special, which we have to keep doing until we're allowed to be with them again.
Yeah, I think it's so important to try to build relationships in a remote way by sharing stories about ourselves, by being as human as possible. And this reminds me of a lecturer that I met in Sheffield, and he used to record sort of 3 to 4 minute clips whilst he was out hill walking, and often with his dog. And this was pre-pandemic. He had already found that his students were much more engaged with his lectures by including these videos of himself. It showed him in a different environment, and it reminded his students that he's not just the guy that stands in front of the lecture theatre talking to them about, I think it was organisational behaviour, but this is what he enjoys doing, this is his hobby, this is his dog. And I think these elements are going to become even more important. You know, I for one have certainly felt more isolated since we've been working from home, and you know, the social element, you know, is hugely important. And I do feel sorry for some students. Despite reading your blog, Sarah, do we feel sorry for first year university students? I do feel sorry for some of them. Yeah, you know, going through this transitionary period in an unprecedented way. You know, so yeah.
Yeah, and it's about bringing those ways of understanding and not feeling isolated. So this, you know, I've had a student who's been anxious in this way before, and this is how we overcame it. I've had a student who's done this before, and this is how we overcame that. And this sense that there's someone else, and you know, it's easy, especially when I mean, I know I teach the very young undergraduates, but it's easy to forget how limited their worldview is so far, you know, 18, 19 years old, so limited. But even some of our postgraduates can have had a quite limited worldview. And so it's helping them to understand that they're not alone, that others have gone through this before is just really, really wonderful. And also I like remembering my students. You know, it's this other sense that, and I don't know how much this is needed, but sometimes it's nice for students to feel confident that they're in good hands. You know, you're in good hands. I've done this before. I've done it a lot. I know a lot of students. I've helped them through things. And especially right now, I can't stand in front of my students, but I can say, look, I remember when I had a student who, you know, who came up to me, and it was in a tutorial, and I said to him, I forgot to name the leader of this tutorial. Could you do it? I said to him as he was walking past me. And I saw him hesitate, and then he said, yes, okay. And he had to lead the tutorial. And he did a fine job. And afterwards I said, oh, that was great, Andrew, thanks so much. It was in passing. And he said, oh, well, I'm really glad I did, because I almost said no, because I'm very scared of talking in public. And I almost said no, but I didn't realize how good I could do and how well I did. And that moment would have changed his life. You know, that moment of courage to say, yes, I'm going to say yes to her, even though I'm really scared. And I didn't even notice he was nervous. And I told him that. And so I think saying that to students who are nervous going into a tutorial is this sense of, we've done this a lot. And as well to lecturers, remind your students what you've done, how much you've done, how many people you've helped, and that you're here to help them. And again, this becomes not just, this is the lecture I'm doing today, or this is the tutorial I'm doing today, but this is something bigger that I'm part of, this kind of transition process. And I actually don't think lecturers give ourselves enough credit sometimes for the amount of effort, emotion, investment we have in our students for the short moments of their lives that we have, that we're part of.
Yeah, and I also think it's good to remind students that they're there to help each other as well, that they already have skills in this area. They're already good friends to a number of people, presumably. And yes, you know, their lecturers are very experienced in helping and shepherding people through this environment, but they should also speak to their peers as often about their anxieties and concerns too.
And this is where stories come in again, because it's about sharing stories. And it's why in my book, I've got so many stories, and we've got the actual pedagogical features that is a student say and a practitioner say, because it says you're not alone in this, you know, and others have gone through it before, just like you're going through it now. And also importantly for some students, others have found this useful, because sometimes, you know, I remember a student, gosh, it was anonymous feedback, so I don't know who the student was, but it was when I just started teaching critical thinking to my students, and I had one piece of feedback that said, I don't know why we have to learn critical thinking. It won't be useful in my life. And I just thought, oh, well, first, you've missed the point. Have I done a bad job? But secondly, you need to listen to other students, older students. This was a first year student. You need to listen to practitioners. There isn't a practitioner today who will not say, in any discipline, critical thinking is not useful. I mean, and so that's why in the book we have so many stories. This is useful. Reminders, this is really, really useful. Not because it'll help you pass your test. It might, but that's not why. It's because university is about more than passing tests. It's about more than exams. It's about that transition into and through your life. So important.
Yeah, and it's not just that your book emphasises that the student should have a right to the voice, but as you say, we actually gave them a voice in the book. We gave them the space to speak directly to their peers. So I'm glad we practiced what we preach there, Sarah. So this sort of ties in nicely. We've been talking about the overall aims of critical thinking, and you know, we're preaching to the choir here in that critical thinking is obviously not just important to university life, but also to you know, professional life and in a personal context. So what are the main aims, Sarah, that you convey to your students when teaching critical thinking?
So it's so important that we don't just say you need to think critically, okay? Because what does that even mean? You know, and it's really difficult. The worst piece of student feedback we can give to students is needs to be more critical. Unless we've explained that in our lectures, and if we have and they still haven't worked it out, or they need to go back to the lectures, but unless we've explained that, students often don't understand. I heard this wonderful saying once, and if anyone knows the origin of it, please get in touch. But it was, I was listening to Radio 4 and I heard this wonderful phrase, which is, to teach something, you need to know two things. To teach one thing, you need to know two things. And I think that's really true. I think sometimes some academics know 10 things, and then it can be hard to remember what it was like to be learning that first thing. And that's why, as academics, I think we need to get our hands around some ways of helping first ourselves understand what it is like to learn that first thing, and then helping our students to do it. And I did, when I first started teaching this, I was looking for a book. I was desperate for a book to help my students. And I couldn't find one. I got a few of the books, but they weren't really doing what I wanted them to do, which was giving my students the tools themselves and a voice and a simple set of tools, sophisticated in application, but simple in use. And that is key, because I don't teach critical thinking to philosophy scholars. I teach critical thinking across all disciplines, to any discipline. And so it doesn't need to go into logical proofs, etc. So I came up with, and this is, you know, from pulling from a lot of different useful texts, but none of which had structured it this way: quality of argument, the strength of evidence, and clarity of communication. And these are the three aims of critical thinking. And that's what my students learn. And if any students are watching, you should be learning it. And that is what, and for those of my past students watching, I hope you remember it because they got sick of me saying it: quality of argument, strength of evidence, clarity of communication. Some might argue clarity of communication is not a critical thinking tool, a critical thinking aim per se. Yes and no. You can do amazing critical thinking without communicating it to anyone. But, you know, what's the point? Like at university and in life, our aim is to communicate our critical thinking. So you know, part 2 of the book, it teaches students how to what is an argument and how do you structure one. And then how, once you've, even if you know how to structure one, how do you develop one from a question if you're just given a question? And then the strength of evidence chapter looks at all the different types of evidence that are out there. And as you said at the start, there's an overwhelming amount of evidence that's really quite scary for students. So it shows them how to start interrogating that evidence, and also the shortcuts you can take, and why academic sources are used. We always say to students, you should use academic sources. Do we explain why? You know, so the book, I am so passionate about explaining why something's important, because that is really useful. And then clarity of communication, both in written, so essays or formal reports, and in spoken oral presentations. But the problem is, I do this analogy in the book, you know, how do you win Wimbledon? Well, you qualify for the main draw and then you beat all your opponents, right? That's not really the point, is it? How you win Wimbledon is with your ground strokes, with your lobs, with your serve, with your volleys. So the third part of the book talks about the 5 tools for critical thinking. And not surprisingly, they overlap with language tools because they're reading, writing, listening, speaking, and thinking. And I actually go into a good amount of detail about not just reading, but active reading. Not just writing, but writing to think. So not writing as an output, not essay writing, that's done in clarity of communication, but writing as a tool to help us work out what we think. And same with listening. You know, you'll remember that review we got back, Nicola, from one of the students. We had students reviewing all the way through who said, I've just read the listening chapter, and I never before thought of listening as a skill. I can't believe I'd never thought of it like that. I'm going to approach my lectures so differently now because I'm going to practice the skill of listening. And so that was one of the greatest review pieces we got back. And then speaking. And speaking is one of my favorites, and speaking is where I am so worried for the current generation. And it's because they sit there and listen. They may be writing, they may be reading, but they won't share their voice. They won't share it. And I think it's largely because they think they're stupid or because they think they'll sound like an idiot or, you know. And so in the book, I talk a lot about failure and the importance of failure and the importance of, you know, fixed mindset, growth mindset, grit, Angela Duckworth's book. I mean, just so many important areas here. And then right in the middle of our little 2x2 matrix is thinking, because thinking and actually understanding type 1, type 2 thinking, or system 1, system 2 thinking, and how to apply that is just so useful. And again, we got that review from a student who talked about the fact that I think it was didn't say, but I think it was a guy who talked about the fact that he'd never thought of thinking as a thing before. He thought it was just something that happened in the background. He'd never considered it something you could improve. Sorry, I get a bit passionate talking about the book. I speak too much, but yeah, very exciting for the book.
Yeah, Sarah, that's all absolutely brilliant. Honestly, you've encapsulated everything. And the only thing I'd like to add to that is these are all precisely the reasons why I wanted to sign this book. There was clearly room for something that was empowering, that placed the lecturer at the heart of this journey, and that above all else was inclusive. So you acknowledge those difficulties that students face, and you have this uncanny ability to sort of understand what they're going through, in that, you know, their reluctance to speak out. Perhaps they've got English as a second language, perhaps they're just shy. But you have this beautiful way of writing that is so reassuring, and the comments we got back from the students, which were heartwarming. They were like, if I'd have this, I think one of them said, I wish I'd have had this book. It would have been the greatest gift at the start of my degree. I really do believe in this book. I think it's going to help a lot of people. And for me, that's the most important thing.
Can I add something there? I know we're going to questions, so no doubt you're looking at the questions and working out what you're going to ask. But let me add something there, which is something you hit on, which I hadn't mentioned. This is a book written for students, but to support lecturers in lecturers' jobs. It's not written separate to university or separate to lecturers. You know, you can't learn critical thinking from this book. Now you can, obviously, that sounds silly, but this book is about how you learn critical thinking at university with your lecturers, with your tutors, what you need to be doing in your lecture hall, what you need to be doing in your tutorials, what you need to be doing in your assessments. And also it acknowledges the importance of discipline-specific differences. So there'll be times I'll say, in strength of evidence, for example, I'll say, this is the strength of evidence and this is how we approach it. But disciplines have different approaches to evidence. So you need to follow your lecturers. If you're unsure, go and ask your lecturers. You need to seek help when I talk about speaking. If you're unsure about speaking in tutorials, seek help from your tutor. That's what they're there for. So this book is the book I wish I had found when I was looking for a book, which is something not to overtake me as a lecturer, because I still think that students learn most from us, from their engagement with us, but it's to help them realize what it is we're doing for them and to help us help them structure it as well.
That's really well put. Thank you very much, Sarah. I really enjoyed that conversation, as I have all of our conversations in this area. So I think what we'll do now is move to the Q&A section. So we welcome any and all questions, so please pop them in the chat box, and I will go over to there now and start answering them. Okay, so we've got a few here. So this is from Dr. Emily Yarrow, who says, you mentioned at the very start the tidal wave of information that students are faced with. With students reading and consuming news from several sources, oftentimes at once, do you think this potentially provides them with greater skills for critical thinking? And how can we capitalise on their everyday experiences of multi-source reading to aid their university experience, their university learning experience, sorry? I think that's a really good question. And Sarah, do you want to take the lead on that?
Yeah, I will. Look, I think we have to be careful not to disparage the fact that students are accessing a lot of information, because that's a good thing. And in days gone by, you know, years and years ago, the problem was people weren't given access to information. So access to information is great, but the ability to deal with and understand that information is the key. And what we need to do is to help our students to ask questions really early on when they start reading something. First, where did they click on it? Before you've even asked it. And there's things I won't read at all, because I will make assumptions about where it is published, and therefore I won't even give it the credibility of starting to read it, and giving the students that kind of that confidence to make those decisions for themselves. So it's week 4 of my teaching, and my students for the tutorial this week were given 2 articles to read. Actually, I've just realized that some of the students have still got tutorials today and tomorrow. Hopefully they're not watching. That's okay. So they've got 2 articles to read, and they have to come and we discuss those articles and discuss the ideas in them. And right at the end, I say, so did anyone look at where the articles were from? And none of them have, almost. Occasionally we have 1 or 2 who have. None of them have, and the sources are really questionable, really questionable. Now, that's okay, I say, because you have assumed there's a credibility of the source because I said it for you, which is fine. But once you start researching for your essay next week, you're just going to go out onto the internet, and then you have to ask. And so I think when we're lecturers, what's really good, students learn not from being told something, but from experiencing something, from sitting in that tutorial and seeing me ask, did anyone look at where this article came from? And feeling that moment of discomfort, that moment of, wow, I really should have done that, you know? And so to Dr. Yarrow's question there, what we have to do is we have to help them experience poor evidence, experience biased or prejudiced evidence in our discipline, so that they can get a sense of how they're going to approach that.
Yeah, and thinking back to my days as an English undergrad, one of the things that we did regularly was to compare 2 different news sources or 2 different takes on the same topic. So that could be an idea too. So you know that they're getting their information from a variety of places, sometimes Twitter in the briefest of ways, other times broadsheet media, etc. So that could be one area of exploration, to try to encourage them to look at the different ways in which the same topic is explored.
And also, I know you've got another question, but one tiny little thing to add there. Always call students out. So in my tutorials, students do not get away with, I read somewhere that. Sorry, where did you read it? What was the evidence? Where is it from? The fact that you read it somewhere gives it almost no credibility. We need to know, where did you read it? So, and it's really important that we kindly jump on those comments. I read somewhere that this. No, not good enough. Where did you read it? Was it good enough credible evidence? And should we consider that when developing our argument, or should we discard it?
So there's another question here from Dan Jones. So he says, often students get distracted by the emotional content of a topic. What is an effective way to disentangle the emotional content of a subject and the objective critical thinking required for a topic? I think that's a brilliant question.
That is such a good question. You know, we do, we're not doing it this year, but in the past few years, we've done topics like the Germanwings air crash, where the pilot flew the plane into the ground, to discuss the issue of mental health. You know, a difficult topic in itself. You know, who should hold responsibility for that? We have discussed issues of surrogacy as a business, and is it okay or not okay, and whose rights are most important. So I bring a lot of emotional topics in. I think naming and so emotion isn't bad. And I think, you know, even though in the book I talk about logos, about logic being the basis for our argument, that doesn't make emotion wrong or poorly placed. Emotion is important. And I wonder, I think it was Dan, was it? I wonder, Dan, if what we do is we should name the emotion up front. We sit there and we say, this is an emotional topic. Let's start by writing down all the emotions that come to mind when we read this topic. And we, you know, get students to write down the emotions that they're feeling. And then we say, okay, let's park those as valuable, but not what we're exploring today. And let's start structuring an argument around different claims, or around, you know, different, you know, premises linked to different claims about the topic. And just by maybe allowing the emotion to exist, but moving it to the side, I wonder if that would be a good way of, because you don't want to say, don't get emotional about this. People should be emotional about things, especially about things that are really valuable. But when we're learning to understand a topic, that's when we need to pick beyond the emotion. So I wonder if that would help. I often get my students to name and then park something to the side when I want them to focus on some other part of it.
I think that's brilliant, Sarah, because that, as you say, it acknowledges their emotions. It doesn't undermine their emotions, but it then gives space for the objectivity to be at the forefront. And you know, this is something that we discuss as a department in the books that we produce. There are certain things that you can't avoid speaking about. You know, we would be remiss if we didn't talk about some contentious topics, and we debate regularly about whether or not we should be putting trigger warnings in, and I know that opinions differ on this. So thank you very much for that question, Dan, and for your answer there, Sarah. So I've got another question.
I know you're jumping to the next question, but I just want to add a tiny little extra thing there, Nicola. It's just, I just remember this situation where it was in the surrogacy lecture, actually, and I had a student who had a tutorial, surrogacy tutorial, who hadn't really gotten in. He was fine, but he hadn't really gotten massively engaged in any of the discussions through the other tutorials. And he was a fine student, it wasn't a problem, but he was never really into it, I guess. And in surrogacy, he became very passionate about the right of the unborn child and about the importance of actually everyone else is making a decision, but that child is not making a decision. It is the innocent party, and so that has to be key. And so the emotion he brought to that, because he was emotional, the emotion he brought to that helped him to engage and actually make a really well-structured argument. So again, I just want to emphasize, objectivity is important, but emotion can be really useful in our students' learning journey too.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. And this is the next question from Ahmad Al-Madawi. Appreciate your great webinar. Thank you very much, Ahmad. Do the students' background and social culture affect their critical thinking? For example, respecting the order of speaking according to the age and young, and how they need to show a high level of respect for others?
Yes, absolutely. It can be in a good way, but also in a difficult way, because we can have, particularly the UK university, we often get a lot of students, international students, who are there to learn from me. they arrive and they're ready to learn from me because I'm Dr. Ivory and I'm, the giver of all information. And it's really difficult for these students when they sort of face the fact that I'm not going to tell them the answer. And actually, as you know, Nicola, the foreword of my book talks about my experience of that in my undergrad, and actually getting a little annoyed at my lecturer who wouldn't give me an answer. But sorry, we were focusing here on the cultural issues. Really important, really difficult, and sometimes hard to overcome. And you don't want to overcome them because they're part of the person's psyche. Equally, why is the student coming to a different culture for university? Presumably, it is to learn about a different way, a different approach, a new language, a new culture themselves. And so it's incumbent upon us to help with that process. But I found that the best way of doing that, again, is to come back to sociality. When students start working in groups together, then they start getting confidence at that level, and they start seeing how other students engage with me and engage in that. And I also wouldn't put this down just to different international cultures or races or religions. I have a student who I'm presuming was a public school boy from England, come up to Edinburgh, and for the whole of the semester he called me Miss. Can I do this, Miss? Can I do that, Miss? Can I do that, Miss? And every time I said, it's Sarah, just call me Sarah. I mean, Dr. Ivory at a push, but Sarah's fine. And also you don't need to ask permission to do that. You're an adult, just do it, right? And and I remember the very last tutorial, he said, Sarah, Sarah, this is my answer or something. And I thought, yes, I've achieved something there. I've helped him move from the sense of you are here being taught to you are part of a learning journey here. But that's my approach. I'm a very informal lecturer. I do understand that some others like a more formal approach, but that's not me.
Thanks very much, Sarah, and I hope that answers the question. We've got one more question now, and I'm conscious that we've probably only got around 3 minutes left. So probably just enough time to answer this one, but of course you can follow up with Sarah and I afterwards with any additional questions. So Natasha and Wheeler asks, what are your thoughts on enabling critical discussion in a virtual breakout room environment? So she says, I'm finding that undergrad students are less reluctant to speak openly, often preferring to text, and that does not always bring out the critical essence of what's being discussed. It's a really good question for the current situation.
Hugely important, Natasha, and I'm afraid I don't have brilliant answers for you because I'm struggling with that at the moment too. Our students want to just type in the chat. They just want to sit there typing in the chat. I can't get them to turn on videos, even to introduce themselves. And we don't want to push that because there are reasons, bandwidth reasons is one, but there are other reasons people don't want to turn on videos. But even to turn on their voice, they don't want to do that. They want to just type answers. And first of all, I think it's really important that we keep trying. Never give up, because it might be the one day you stop asking, could you turn on your microphone and speak? Might be the one day they've built up their confidence to do so. So never give up. I think breakout rooms are a good idea. Set a very specific question from the breakout room, a very specific question, and say someone has to come back and speak to us and explain the answer. That means that people don't feel as much pressure. It's a type of pair and share. Pair and share works because people get to practice an answer with someone else to check that they're not sounding stupid. That's why it works. And when that other person doesn't think they sound stupid, they come back and then they speak and they share. And so that's what breakout rooms are good for. It gives them a chance to speak to one other person and then come back. But I do think at the moment, Natasha, I would say any engagement you can get at all, just go with it. So if it's only typing, it means they're listening. So let's embrace that. I mean, you could go back to my 5 tools, right? Writing, reading, speaking, listening, and thinking. If they're listening and they're writing, it's something, okay? It's something. Presumably that means they're thinking too, okay? That's 3 out of 5. That ain't bad, okay? We might not be getting them to speak, and we might not, well, they are reading as well because they'll have to read other people's answers. And in fact, I guess I'm just thinking on the spot here, that would be a great thing. Could everyone read, for example, could everyone read Robin's contribution here and tell me what you think about that? Now, there would be a good way of them having to read, think, process, and then write something. So Natasha, I don't know if that's great. I'm struggling too, though. I'm really struggling with the digital seminars, and I'm doing the best of it. And I'm hoping that the students, every time we do it, just get that little bit more confident.
And I'd just like to add to Sarah's answer there, Natasha, by letting you know that Chapter 10, which is on speaking, which is one of the 5 tools, is actually available as a free sample chapter. So you can take a look at that, and there might be some tips in there on how you can perhaps help students reassure them that everybody else feels the same, and that try to empower them to use their voice in the virtual environment. So there should be some tips in there for you too.
I know we're out of time, but one other thing I thought of, Natasha, and it's a tip I got from, I did a session with a professional webinar person, I guess, and she said, I asked this exact question, and she said, always use the students' names first. Because if you say, what do you think about that, Natasha? Then they don't realize they have to think of an answer, and they're struggling to find their microphone click. Whereas if I say, Natasha, could I ask you this question and get you to answer it? What do you think about X, Y, Z? That has given you time to get ready, process, be on the button to actually turn on your microphone and be ready to go. So this woman who I did this session with said, always use people's names first so they know that it's being directed at them. And I thought that was a great tip as well.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you to everybody for your engagement throughout this session and for your absolutely fantastic questions. I hope that Sarah and I have managed to answer them, and I also hope that you found this session really applied and useful, and have some good takeaways from it. Sarah and I would love to hear your feedback, and there'll be details on how you can get in touch with us both shortly after this, and of course please do keep any comments coming. It's been an absolute pleasure this afternoon, and I mean that genuinely, to sit here and to get involved in this community of best practice. It really is fantastic, so thank you so much.
Thanks everyone.